Welcome back to Secret Speaks. How has your day been? Now let's uncover the mystery hidden in today's story. For years, I believed sacrifice was the duty of a mother. I paid their bills, raised their children, and filled their table when they had nothing left. I thought love meant silence, swallowing every slight, every cold look, every thankless request. But one sentence at dinner tore through all those years. My daughter-in-law laughed that I should eat what the dog leaves behind. In that moment, something inside me broke free. I was no longer the wallet they depended on, or the shadow that kept them safe. I was still their mother, but I would never again be their servant. That insult became the spark that changed everything. I sat at the dinner table that evening trying to convince myself it would be just another ordinary family meal. Michael had poured me a glass of water, Emily was seated across from me with her phone tucked under her napkin, and Joshua was busy poking at his peas. Stephanie, as always, held the center of the table like a queen on her throne. She had prepared steaks, thick cuts seared just right, the kind I used to buy with my own paycheck when money was tighter for them. The smell was rich and heavy in the air. I cut into my potato, my fork pausing, when Stephanie leaned back in her chair with that smirk she wore whenever she wanted to make sure everyone noticed her. Her eyes sparkled, but it was the sharp kind of sparkle, the one that warned me she had a jab ready. She laughed lightly and then said in a voice that carried too easily, "Mother Turner will eat whatever the dog leaves behind." The sound of it landed in the room like a glass shattering. For a second there was silence, then a ripple of nervous laughter spread around the table. It was not laughter of warmth or shared humor. It was brittle, uncomfortable, and every chuckle felt like a knife tip against my skin. My fork froze halfway to my mouth. I looked at Stephanie. She was cutting into her steak juices, sliding across the plate, her face flushed with the satisfaction of her own cruelty. She thought she was clever. I had been the one buying meat like this for years, when Michael lost his job, when bills stacked high on their counter. I had stood in grocery aisles counting bills from my pension just to make sure their fridge was full. And now at 72 years old, I was apparently fit to eat scraps no better than their golden retriever Max. I felt my cheeks heat, but it was not shame. It was clarity, a sudden flare in my chest that pushed out the years of swallowing small insults and pretending they were nothing. Every clipped thank you, every cold shrug, every unspoken expectation I had stepped over, telling myself it was not worth the fight. It was all piled high inside me, and in that moment I felt the weight of it pressing hard. I set my fork down carefully, not with a clatter, but with intention. My hands were steady. I reached across the table. Stephanie's knife hung in the air, her eyes widening as she realized I was not reaching for bread or for salt. I picked up the untouched half of her steak from her plate. No one spoke. Michael's glass of wine hovered in front of his lips. Emily's eyes went wide, her mouth slightly open. Joshua glanced from his sister to me, too young to understand the storm brewing. Stephanie's voice caught in her throat, but nothing came out. I stood up without a word. Max was curled on his bed in the corner of the dining room, tail flicking lazily. His head lifted as I walked over. I bent down, placed the steak gently into his bowl, and stepped back. Max blinked at me with confusion before sniffing the meat, then began to eat with noisy enthusiasm. The sound of his chewing filled the silence that had swallowed the room. I walked back to my chair and sat down, my movements calm, deliberate. I picked up my water glass, took a sip, and said evenly, "Well, I suppose now we will both find out how much the dog leaves me." From the other end of the table came a choked sound. Emily had clapped a hand over her mouth, but not before a small laugh slipped free. Her eyes met mine, and in that quick flash, I saw something new in her. admiration, solidarity. Stephanie's face turned red, her lips pressed so tightly they looked bloodless. That was a joke. She managed her voice sharp, her fork clattering against the plate. I nodded, cutting into my potato, the knife sliding easily through. I know I said calmly. So was mine. No one else spoke for the rest of the meal. The scrape of cutlery on china and the wet chomping of Max filled the silence. My son sat rigid beside his wife, his jaw tight, his eyes darting between us but never landing on me. Under the table, I felt the lightest pressure against my shoe. Emily's foot, small and deliberate, pressed once before retreating. A silent gesture, but one that told me she understood more than anyone else in that room. The rest of the dinner stretched on painfully. I chewed slowly, letting each bite sit heavy on my tongue, not because the food was good, but because silence had weight, and I wanted them to feel every ounce of it. The clinking glasses, the scrape of knives, the creak of a chair shifting were all sharper than usual, the air thick enough that it felt like another body at the table. When my plate was empty, I placed my fork neatly across it, folded my napkin, and pushed my chair back. No one looked up. Michael stared at his hands. Stephanie's lips were pressed tight in a stubborn line, and Joshua kept his head down, too focused on his food to risk glancing up. Emily finally broke the stillness by dropping her napkin onto her lap, a little too loudly, her way of creating a pause where none of them dared. I excused myself softly and walked toward the kitchen, the warmth of the overhead light spilling across the tiled floor. My hands trembled just slightly as I turned on the faucet, letting warm water run over my fingers. I focused on the sound, this steady rush that seemed louder than anything behind me. For years, this kitchen had been mine in spirit, the place where I rose at dawn to make breakfasts, pack lunches, and set up mornings for children who were not even my own to raise. I dried my hands carefully, hanging the towel back in its place, then sat down again with my coffee. I was not in a hurry to leave. Let them feel the heaviness of my presence the way I had carried theirs for years, mine born of duty, theirs heavy with judgment. Emily slipped into the doorway. After a few minutes, her hair loose now, her sweatshirt oversized and soft, the one I had given her last Christmas. She slid into the seat beside me, her voice low, almost conspiratorial. "Grandma, that was the best thing I have ever seen you do." I raised an eyebrow, sipping slowly. "Feeding the dog." She grinned, her voice hushed but fierce. "Feeding the dog her dinner." "You should have seen her face." I let the smallest smile cross my lips. "Sometimes I said you have to speak in a language people understand." Her grin faded into something gentler. "They should not talk to you like that." Her words were simple, but they sank deep. She was only 17, but young enough to see unfairness without excuses, old enough to know when cruelty had become normal. She reached for my hand under the table, squeezed it quickly, and let go as footsteps approached. Stephanie's voice floated from the kitchen. "Michael, is your mother still here?" Her tone was polite enough, but the push was unmistakable. I set my coffee down steady as stone. For the first time in years, I felt no urge to smooth things over, no need to swallow words. The evening had already shifted, and so had I. The air in the dining room was still heavy, but inside me there was a spark of something I had not felt in a long time. Resolve. This was not going to be just another night to forget. This was the night something began to change. I drove home that night with the streetlights sliding across the windshield, each one flickering like a quiet reminder of the years behind me. My house in Cincinnati felt colder than usual when I walked in, though I knew it was not the air, but the emptiness. The walls were lined with pictures Robert in his work overalls before his heart gave out in 2010, Michael in his cap and gown, Emily as a little girl, with her missing front teeth. Each photo felt like a chapter I had lived for someone else. When Robert died, I was 59 and still teaching full-time at Maplewood Elementary. The mornings were long, the evenings longer, and every penny I earned felt like it had to stretch farther than my own needs. Michael was still trying to finish college then. He came home broken by grief, and I told myself I would carry both our weights. I worked double shifts, picked up tutoring on weekends, and packed every dollar into his tuition. He graduated not on time, but he graduated, and I told myself that was enough. I remember the night I sat at the kitchen table, and spread out Robert's chair across from me, still empty. Michael had asked for help with a down payment, said it was his chance to finally build something stable. I pulled from my retirement savings without blinking, signed a check for $20,000, and told myself that was what mothers did. He and Stephanie moved into a tidy 2-story on Oak Ridge Drive, and I stayed in the same small house Robert and I had shared, telling myself their comfort was worth my sacrifice. Stephanie had thanked me that day, her smile sharp but polite. Over time, those thank yous grew fewer, and I stopped waiting for them. I paid for Emily's piano lessons, her braces, her summer camps. When Joshua was born, I covered the hospital bills that insurance did not. Each time I told myself it was love, it was duty, it was the only way to keep my family strong. I see now how easy it was to slip into that role. Every request felt urgent. Every need sounded like survival. When their washer and dryer broke in 2015, I drove across town with my checkbook and told them to pick the best model. When Michael's car was repossessed, I signed another loan in my name so he could get to work. When Stephanie wanted to take a business course to expand her spa, I covered the $8,000 fee. Each year blurred into the next, each sacrifice becoming so ordinary that I almost forgot they were sacrifices at all. There were moments, though, when the cracks showed. I remember one Christmas when I bought them a new set of appliances, wrapped a note with the receipt tucked inside. Stephanie opened the envelope, glanced at the numbers, and said simply, "Good we needed that." She set the paper aside and moved on to the next gift without a hug, without a glance at me. Michael shifted in his chair, not embarrassed enough to speak up. I swallowed the sting and told myself it did not matter, that giving was enough. The years after Robert died were measured not in my own milestones, but in theirs. Emily's school plays, Joshua's soccer games, Michael's promotions, Stephanie's new spa clients. I was there for every win, every setback, and my role was always the same: to patch the holes, to fill the gaps, to make sure they never felt the ground give way beneath them. I poured everything I had into that house on Oak Ridge Drive, but I was never more than a visitor there, a guest in the home I had paid for piece by piece. There were nights when I sat alone in my own kitchen, the clock ticking loud, the television humming in the background, and wondered when I had stopped being a person and started being a safety net. I brushed those thoughts away, quickly told myself they were ungrateful, but still mine to care for. If Robert had been alive, he would have done the same. That was the story I repeated until it felt like truth. But the truth was sharper. The truth was that I had erased myself, hidden behind the mask of selflessness, until there was nothing left that was just mine. My closet held clothes years out of style. My vacations were canceled so they could take theirs. My pension slipped away into their mortgages and tuition bills. I became a shadow, not because they asked me to, but because I believed it was my place. Sitting in my living room after that dinner, I stared at the photo of Robert on the mantel. His eyes in the picture seemed steady kind, but I could not shake the thought that he would have hated to see me this way, drained of dignity, swallowed whole by obligation. I whispered into the quiet, asking him if I had done right, if I had carried too much, if somewhere along the way I had confused sacrifice with love. The house was silent. Only the hum of the refrigerator answered. I leaned back in my chair, the old springs creaking, and I felt the years of weight pressing against me. It was not just Stephanie's words at that table, though they cut deep. It was the culmination of every time I had told myself it did not matter, that silence was easier, that gratitude was not the point. That night, the realization settled in me like a stone. For more than a decade, I had lived as the ghost of Robert's absence, as Michael's safety net, as Stephanie's silent bank. I had given them my time, my money, my health, and in return, I had become invisible. I thought of Emily's laugh at the table small and stifled the way her foot pressed against mine under the tablecloth. She had seen me, if only for a moment. She had seen that I was more than the shadow they treated me as. For the first time in years, I let myself sit with the anger, not push it down. It was not anger at them alone, but at myself for believing my worth could only be measured by what I gave away. The clock on the wall struck 11. I turned off the lamp and sat in the dark for a moment longer, the silence thick, my heartbeat steady. In that stillness, I felt something stir, something I had buried too long. It was not rage or grief, but a faint pulse of resolve, fragile but alive. I had spent 12 years playing the role of sacrifice, believing it was my only choice, but maybe it was not. Maybe it was time to find out who I was without carrying everyone else. I stood slowly, my knees stiff, and walked toward the bedroom. As I pulled back the covers, I felt a heaviness settle across me, not just the tiredness of the day, but of the years stacked behind me. Lying there in the dark, I closed my eyes and let the thought repeat until it no longer frightened me. I had been a shadow long enough. The morning light came in weak through the blind stripes across my kitchen table, where I sat with a stack of old bank statements and a notebook. The coffee had gone cold beside me untouched as I drew the first line across the top of the page. I had never done this before, never written it all down in one place. I think part of me had been afraid to see it in black and white. I opened the first folder papers, creased from being folded and refolded over the years. There was the check I had written in 2011, $20,000 for the down payment on Michael and Stephanie's house. I copied the number carefully into the notebook. My pen scratched against the paper louder in the stillness than it should have been. Next came the receipt from the university bursar's office, $8,000 for Michael's last semester of tuition. That was 2012. I remembered the year I worked weekends tutoring neighborhood kids in math, just to cover it. I wrote the number, circled it, and kept going. The list grew quickly. $2,000 here for a new washer and dryer when theirs broke. $3,000 to replace Michael's car when it was repossessed. $500 to cover Stephanie's business license fee. Another $8,000 for that spa course she swore would make her successful. $1,500 when their heating system failed one January and the children were shivering in the cold. I turned page after page, filling line after line, and the total crept higher. I stopped once to stretch my hand, the pen leaving an ink blot where it rested. My heart pounded in my ears as if I were running, but all I was doing was sitting at my own kitchen table. When I reached the year 2019, I remembered clearly writing a check for Emily's braces. $4,000. I had been glad to do it proud, even because her smile mattered to me more than anything. But seeing it there among all the others reminded me it had been one more piece of myself given away without question. The last entries were more recent. 2 mortgage payments in 2022 when Michael lost his job at the sales company downtown. Another payment in early 2023 when Stephanie said she needed cash flow for the spa to stay open. Each time I had told myself it was temporary, that things would stabilize. Each time I had dipped into the money Robert and I had saved for our own retirement. By the time I set the pen down, my notebook looked like an account ledger, neat rows of generosity that no one had kept track of but me. I took a deep breath and began to add them. 10,000, 20,000, 40, 60. My fingers trembled as the sum rose higher and higher, each total heavier than the last. When I finally reached the end, I stared at the number at the bottom of the page. $122,350. I pressed the pen against the paper until the tip tore through. My breath caught. That was more money than I had ever let myself think about in one piece. It was more than the cost of the small condo I had once dreamed of buying downtown, the one with the balcony overlooking the park where Robert and I used to walk on Sundays. It was more than enough to have secured my own peace for the rest of my life. I closed my eyes and let the weight of that number sink in. 12 years. 12 years of checks and transfers and envelopes slipped across tables. 12 years of telling myself it was fine, that family was worth any sacrifice. All those years, and here I sat in the same house Robert and I had bought when Michael was still a boy, walls in need of paint carpet, worn thin furniture older than Emily. I thought of the look on Stephanie's face at dinner, the way she had leaned back in her chair and tossed her words like scraps. All that money, all that time, all that care, and in the end, she had measured me against a dog. My hands shook as I flipped back through the notebook. Line after line of proof, not of my love, but of how invisible I had become. They had not even asked where the money came from, never wondered what it cost me. They had assumed it would always be there, as reliable as the sunrise. I stood and walked to the window, pulling the curtain aside. Outside, the neighborhood was waking up, cars starting, dogs barking, a jogger passing with headphones in. Ordinary lives, each person carrying their own burdens. I wondered if any of them had ever given away enough to erase themselves. I went back to the table, touched the notebook as if it might burn me. The truth was, right there in ink, I could have built a different life with that money. I could have traveled, replaced the roof on my house, invested in something that was mine alone. I could have taken Robert's memory to Paris, the way we used to dream, sat at a cafe with a book in hand, breathing air that was only mine. Instead, I had given it all away piece by piece until the sum totaled more than my own worth in their eyes. I pushed the notebook aside and sat back hard in my chair. The refrigerator hummed, the clock ticked, and my heart thudded in my chest. I felt anger, yes, but beneath it something quieter, heavier. Regret. I whispered the number out loud, testing how it sounded in the air. 122,350. The syllables filled the room, echoing off the walls like a judgment. It was not just a number, it was my life measured in sacrifice, tallied without gratitude. I looked again at Robert's photo on the mantel, his smile frozen in time, his eyes steady. I wanted to believe he would have told me I had done enough, that I had given too much, that I had lost myself trying to keep everyone else afloat. For the first time in years, I wondered if the life I had been holding together was worth the price I had paid. The number on the page glared back at me, undeniable. It was a truth I could not ignore any longer. The next morning, I dressed with more care than usual, pulling on navy slacks and a pressed white blouse shoes polished enough to squeak against the kitchen tile. I tucked the blue folder under my arm, the the one that now held the pages of numbers and receipts, and I locked the door behind me with a sense of purpose I had not felt in years. The air was crisp, the kind of early spring morning where you can still see your breath, and I drove downtown to Midwest First Bank with my hands steady on the wheel. Inside the lobby, the smell of polished wood and disinfectant greeted me. A young man in a navy suit offered a polite nod as I walked past the counters. I asked to see a personal banker, and within minutes, I was shown into a small office where Clara Johnson sat waiting. She looked to be in her 40s, hair neatly pulled back, glasses perched low on her nose. She smiled professionally. "How can I help you today, Mrs. Walker?" I laid the folder on her desk and folded my hands. "I want to cancel every automatic transfer to my son Michael's account, effective immediately, and I want his access to my savings removed today." Clara's fingers hesitated over her keyboard. "Every transfer? Yes. Every single one." She glanced at the papers I slid across. Years of support itemized in my handwriting, totals circled in thick black ink. Her eyes widened slightly, but she schooled her face back to neutral. "These are significant amounts. Some monthly, some quarterly. Are you sure you want to stop all of them at once?" I looked her in the eye. I have never been more certain of anything in my life. From today forward, I am not funding their household, not their mortgage, not their spa, not their cars. From today, I no longer raise a grown family with my own retirement. Clara nodded slowly. "Understood. We will need to sign some forms, and I will verify which accounts have linked permissions." As she typed, I felt the strangest sense of release, as if a weight was sliding off my shoulders. She printed out pages for me to initial one by one, and each signature felt like cutting a cord that had been tied around my ribs for too long. Mortgage assistance, tuition payments, car insurance, credit cards. I signed them all away. When Clara gathered the stack, she looked at me with a hint of surprise. "That is quite a history of support." "It is," I said evenly, "but it is over." She tapped a few more keys and then said, "All linked access has been removed. The transfers are canceled. There may be one or two already processing, but after today, nothing further will go out." "Thank you." I reached again for the folder and pulled out a separate sheet. "I would also like to open a trust account in my granddaughter Emily's name. I will be the trustee until she turns 25. For the first time, Clara's smile softened from professional to something warmer. "That is a thoughtful choice." We spent the next half hour arranging it. I transferred a sum that made my throat tighten, not from fear, but from pride. Enough to cover her college, maybe a down payment on her own home one day. Money safe from her parents, money that would not vanish into car payments or spa bills. Clara confirmed the protections, explaining that the funds could not be touched except under the trust terms. I nodded, feeling stronger with each detail. When it was finished, she slid the confirmation copies toward me. "Here are the records for your files." I gathered the papers carefully. For years, my bag had been lighter when I left this bank emptied by withdrawals and transfers. Today, it was heavier with signed documents, proof that the tide had turned. As I stood, Clara said softly, "Mrs. Walker, I hope you feel some peace in this decision." "I do," I told her. "More than I expected." Walking back through the lobby, I noticed how bright the light looked streaming through the tall glass windows. Outside, the city moved as it always had, cars rushing, people hurrying with their coffees. But inside me, something had shifted. For the first time in more than a decade, I felt like my money was mine, my choices were mine, my life was mine. My phone buzzed as I reached the car. Michael's name lit the screen, then went dark when I slipped it back into my purse. Let him wonder. Let him call the bank and hear what I had already made clear. I drove home slowly, the papers on the passenger seat like a shield. Each red light gave me a moment to breathe, to taste the freedom in my own lungs. By the time I turned into my driveway, the sun had risen higher, throwing gold across the grass. I carried the folder inside and placed it on the table where Robert's photo stood. His smile seemed steadier than ever. I rested my hand on the folder. Emily's future was protected, my accounts were clean, and the lifeline I had extended for so long was finally cut. The silence in the house no longer felt heavy. It felt earned. The first call came just after I had finished washing the breakfast dishes. Michael's name lit up the screen, the sound of the ringtone echoing too loudly in my quiet kitchen. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. A minute later, the phone buzzed again. Another call. Then a third. By the fourth attempt, I switched the phone to silent and set it face down on the counter. The dishwasher hummed as if nothing had changed, but my pulse beat faster knowing what those calls meant. He had gone to pay the mortgage and found the transfer missing. I sat at the table with my coffee, staring at the steam curling upward. It felt good to let the calls go unanswered. For years, I had jumped at every ring, rearranged my day around his needs, his emergencies. Now each unanswered call was its own small victory. That afternoon, the voicemails began stacking. The first was Michael, his tone, half confusion, half irritation. "Mom, the bank says the payment didn't go through. Did you forget to authorize it? Call me back." The second came an hour later, sharper. "Mom, it happened again. The account is blocked or something. This is serious. We need to talk." By the third, his voice carried the edge of anger. "I don't know what you're doing, but this is putting us in a terrible spot. Call me back now." I deleted each one without listening to the end. The first message from Stephanie came that evening, clipped and cold. "Mary, this isn't how families treat each other. You can't just cut us off without warning. We have obligations, the children have needs. You need to explain yourself." I held the phone in my hand, listening to her words dissolve into silence. Then I erased that one too. The text started the next morning. Michael's messages filled the screen. "Mortgage is due. We're late already. What happened at the bank? Answer me." Then another. "This is irresponsible. You can't just stop paying without telling us." And another. "Stephanie is furious. We can't live like this. Call me." Each one came like a drumbeat, but I ignored them all. The folder on my table reminded me why. $122,000. Years of silence and dismissal. That number was my answer, even if I never said it aloud. By the end of the day, I could feel the ripple of tension even from a distance. The silence between their messages stretched, then broke with another voicemail. Michael's voice sounded strained tight. "Stephanie and I had a fight about this. She says it's my fault for depending on you too much. I told her you always offered. Now she's saying we can't trust you anymore. We're falling apart over here. Please, Mom, just pick up." I sat on the couch with Robert's photo beside me, the evening news murmuring in the background. My thumb hovered over the phone for a long moment. Then I set it back down. Not tonight. Around 9, a different tone buzzed. A message from Emily. "Grandma, are you okay? Mom and Dad have been yelling all night. I heard them through the walls. They're blaming each other about the money. Dad says he thought you would always help. Mom says it was stupid to count on you. I don't know what's happening, but I'm worried about you." I closed my eyes, feeling both sorrow and pride. She should not have to witness their fights, not at her age, but her message told me she understood more than they gave her credit for. I typed back slowly. "I'm fine, sweetheart. You don't need to worry about me. Focus on your schoolwork. Everything else will settle in its own way." Her reply came quickly. "Okay, Grandma. Just promise you'll tell me if you need me. I love you." I held the phone against my chest for a moment, letting her words soak in. Out of all of them, she was the one who saw me, really saw me. The next morning, I found 2 more messages from Michael, both sent late in the night. The first was frantic. "The bank won't release anything. They said only you have control now. We can't cover the payment this month. Do you understand what that means?" The second was quieter, almost pleading. "Mom, please don't do this." The contrast struck me. Anger followed by desperation, both clawing for the same thing. It was no longer just about the mortgage. It was about control, about the lifeline they thought would never end. I brewed tea instead of coffee, holding the mug in both hands, as if the warmth could steady me. I thought of Emily lying awake, listening to her parents argue. I thought of Stephanie's sharp tone of Michael's rising panic. And for the first time in years, I did not feel guilty. I felt free. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock on the wall. Outside, the world moved on as if nothing had changed, but inside their home, I knew the air must have been heavy with blame and anger. I set the mug down and walked to the window. The garden looked the same as always, early tulips pushing up through the soil, the sky pale and open. Life kept growing even when people tangled themselves in knots. The phone buzzed again. Another message. This time from Stephanie. "You've started something you can't take back." I did not respond. I simply closed the curtain and let the silence return. I scheduled the appointment at Hanley and Associates for a Tuesday morning. The building was one of those old brick offices near the courthouse in Cedar Rapids, with polished brass on the door that caught the sunlight as I walked in. The receptionist greeted me by name, and within minutes I was led into a private office lined with shelves of thick law books. Thomas Hanley rose from behind his desk to shake my hand. He had been my attorney for nearly 15 years steady, and measured the kind of man who always seemed to have patience in reserve. His hair had turned mostly silver since the last time I saw him, but his eyes were sharp. "Margaret, it has been too long. Please sit." I settled into the leather chair across from him, the folder resting in my lap. My voice was steady. "I need to change my will and establish a new trust." He leaned back slightly, fingers steepled. "All right. Tell me what you have in mind." I opened the folder and pulled out the page I had prepared. My son Michael and his wife Stephanie will no longer be my primary beneficiaries. The bulk of my estate will go to my granddaughter Emily. Thomas studied me quietly for a long moment. "That is a significant change. Are you certain?" "Yes. My son treats me like a wallet. My granddaughter treats me like a person. That is all the certainty I need." He nodded slowly, his pen poised above his notepad. "I must advise you, Margaret, whenever a major shift like this occurs, especially when one family member is favored over another, there is risk. Your son or daughter-in-law could challenge the will claim, undue influence. Say that Emily pressured you. I had prepared for this." I reached into the folder and placed a sealed envelope on his desk. "My physician's statement from last week. Dr. Reynolds confirmed I am in sound mind and fully competent to make legal decisions." Thomas glanced at the envelope, then back at me. "That is wise. It will strengthen the documents against any claim." I exhaled, the knot in my chest loosening slightly. "I am not doing this out of spite. I am doing this to protect what I have left, to place it where it will be valued." He adjusted his glasses, his voice firm but kind. "Then let us get it right." For the next hour, we reviewed every asset. The house Robert and I had bought in 1987 modest but paid off. The savings account I had finally wrested from Michael's access. A small portfolio Robert's employer had left us still producing dividends. Piece by piece, Thomas drafted the language airtight precise. When he came to the trust, he explained each line carefully. Emily Walker will have access to the funds when she turns 25. Until then, you, Margaret Walker, will serve as trustee. If you should pass before she reaches that age, a secondary trustee must be named. I did not hesitate. Janet Miller, my oldest friend, she has been beside me through everything, and she has never asked me for a dime. Thomas wrote it down, his pen scratching steadily. Good choice. At one point, he looked up again. Margaret, you know this decision will not sit quietly in your family. They may not forgive it. I held his gaze. They have already shown me what my value is to them. I am not cutting them out of my life. I am cutting them out of my finances. There is a difference. He gave the faintest smile, the kind of smile that carried a measure of respect. Then let us make sure they cannot undo what you choose today. When the documents were ready, he slid them across the desk. The pages looked heavier than paper should the black ink dense with meaning. I picked up the pen. My hand did not shake. As the tip touched the paper, I felt as if chains I had worn for years were loosening. With each signature, I cut through another link. By the time I placed the pen down, I felt taller, lighter, almost free. Thomas gathered the signed pages carefully. These will be finalized this week. You will receive certified copies for your records. I will retain the originals in our safe. I thanked him, my voice softer than before, but steadier too. As I left the office, the spring air hit my face cool and bracing. The traffic on Main Street bustled as always, but to me, it sounded like applause, a chorus of ordinary life that I had rejoined on my own terms. I walked to my car with the sun glinting on the windshield and the echo of my last signature still ringing inside me. For the first time in more than a decade, I was not carrying chains. I was carrying my own future. The morning after my visit to the attorney's office, I woke with a heaviness in my chest that was not sorrow, but anticipation. I moved through the house slowly, making coffee, feeding the birds in the garden, folding the Afghan that always slipped from the arm of the couch. The documents I had signed the day before rested safely in their folder on the dining table. Every time I glanced at them, I felt the air in my lungs expand a little more. By the afternoon, the quiet was broken by the sound of an engine idling outside. I peered through the curtain and saw the familiar black SUV. Stephanie sat behind the wheel, sunglasses covering her eyes, phone in her hand. She did not move for a long moment. Finally, she opened the door and stepped onto the pavement, her heels sharp against the driveway. I stepped onto the porch with the day's mail in my hand. She lifted her chin. We need to talk, Margaret. I stayed where I was. What is it you think we need to talk about? She came closer, the red scarf at her throat bright in the sunlight. She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and folded her arms. People are saying things. Did you really shut off the money? Did you really change your will? Yes, I said, simply. Her lips parted. So you admit it. You cut your own son out. I did not flinch. I corrected her. I cut my son out of my finances. There is a difference. Her jaw tightened. You're choosing Emily over him. That's cruel. No, I said. I am choosing respect over exploitation. Emily treats me like a human being. Michael, and you treat me like an ATM. The words hung between us. A car passed slowly down the street and the moment stretched thin. Stephanie shifted her weight onto the first stair. Her voice dropped lower. Michael is drowning. The mortgage, the spa, the kids. You know what this is doing to him. Old habits tugged at me. For decades, I had rushed in when I heard words like drowning, burden, responsibility, but I gripped the porch railing until my knuckles whitened and stood firm. His choices are his to manage. They are not mine anymore. She leaned closer, her perfume sharp and heavy. This is about revenge, isn't it? About one stupid joke over dinner. No, this is about years of disrespect. That dinner just revealed what had been there all along. She let out a short laugh that carried no humor. Do you think Emily even wants this? Do you think she'll thank you for pitting her against her parents? Emily doesn't have to thank me, I said. She just has to know that I stood up for myself. That's enough. Her face flushed. You've always liked playing the martyr. Now you want to play queen. I met her eyes. I don't want to play anything. I want to live free. She pressed her lips together, then tried again with a different tactic. If you care at all about appearances, you'll revise the will to give Michael something, even a token. It will make things easier in court. I shook my head. Appearances have already cost me enough. I will not pay more for them. Her mask cracked for a second, fear flashing through her anger. Do you realize what happens if the mortgage defaults? The bank will call? The children might have to change schools. Everything will spill out into the open. I said quietly, consequences follow choices. If the house is too large to keep, they should have thought of that before. Her voice sharpened again. Just one payment, Margaret. One. For the sake of the children. No. Her sunglasses slipped slightly, and I saw her eyes narrow. You'll regret this. I placed the mail under my arm and reached for the door. I already regret waiting so long. She planted a foot on the second stair as if to block me. You cannot shut me out. We are family. Family is not a key, I said. My door opens by invitation. Her hands curled into fists at her sides. Michael will be here soon. He will make you see reason. If he wants to speak to me, he can do it calmly alone and with respect. Otherwise, he can stay away. The silence between us thickened. A breeze stirred the branches of the maple tree, scattering tiny blossoms across the driveway. She straightened her coat, her mouth twisted in disdain. You're not yourself. For the first time, I smiled. I am more myself than I have been in years. Her voice dropped to a hiss. Everyone will know what you've done. They'll say you've lost your mind. Let them, I said. I know the truth. Her heels clicked as she backed down the steps, her composure cracking as she turned toward the car. She paused with her hand on the door handle, throwing one last line over her shoulder. You'll remember this moment, Margaret. I answered softly, I will. I stepped inside and closed the door firmly. The sound reverberated through the hallway and through my chest. I leaned against it, trembling with the leftover surge of adrenaline. My hands shook, but my spine held straight. Through the lace curtain, I watched her sit in the SUV for a full minute, phone pressed to her ear. Her mouth moved quickly sharp and clipped, no doubt relaying the story to Michael before she even pulled away. Then the car roared down the street, scattering gravel at the curb. I stayed in the hallway counting slow breaths until the rhythm of my heart steadied. The quiet of the house wrapped around me, no longer empty but protective. I went to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and drank it in long gulps. My reflection in the window above the sink looked older, yes, but also firmer, clearer. On the dining table, the folder lay where I had left it. I touched the cool paper and felt a sense of calm return. Stephanie's fury had not shaken me. If anything, it had shown me how strong the wall now was between obligation and freedom. I sat for a long time at the table listening to the steady tick of the clock. The late afternoon light shifted across the floor in pale gold squares. My body still buzzed from the confrontation, but underneath the trembling was a foundation of certainty. The door had closed. The decision had held. And for the first time in years, I believed it always would. The following week, the air in the neighborhood shifted. It was not anything you could touch, but I could feel it in the way people's eyes lingered too long or slid away too quickly. At the post office, Mrs. Lee, who usually greeted me warmly, offered only a polite nod and busied herself with her stamps. At the grocery store, Mr. Brown, once eager to chat about his tomato plants, gave me a look filled with something that felt like pity. Their glances carried words I had not heard directly, but I knew well enough what they meant. The gossip had started. It reached me first through the careful silence of people I had known for decades. Then it arrived louder, carried by Janice Miller, my oldest friend, who showed up on my doorstep with a pie and concern in her eyes. She set the pie down on the counter and took my hand, her grip firm. "Margaret, they're saying things." I sat at the table, the clock ticking steadily behind me. "Tell me." She sighed, brushing crumbs from her sleeve, though she had not eaten yet. "Patricia, you know Stephanie's cousin, the one who's clerking at the law firm downtown. She's been telling people you changed your will because you're paranoid. She's hinting you're not thinking clearly anymore, planting the seed that someone must have influenced you." I closed my eyes briefly, then opened them again. "Patricia." "I barely know her." Janice's voice sharpened. "That's the point. She's laying groundwork, making it sound like they'll contest the will when the time comes. She wants people to believe you're unstable." I felt the familiar surge of heat in my chest, anger laced with disappointment. After everything, they were not only taking my money, but trying to steal my dignity. I stared at the pie between us, the crust golden and neat, and tried to calm my breath. Janice leaned forward. I told her off when I heard it. I told her I have known you for 50 years, and you are sharper now than ever. But gossip spreads fast. Later that day at the market, I felt it again. A woman I had never spoken to before whispered to her companion, eyes flicking toward me as she pretended to sort apples. Their voices were low, but I caught the word paranoid. I placed my bread and milk in the basket and walked on, shoulders straight, but inside the sting landed. That evening, I sat alone in the living room, Robert's picture on the mantel. The street outside was quiet, but in my head, the whispers grew louder. Not yourself, unstable, paranoid, words designed to undercut every choice I had made. I thought of the physician's letter tucked in my folder, proof of my mind's clarity, but paper does not silence gossip. Janice came again 2 days later. She poured tea into my favorite cup and said firmly, "Margaret, listen to me. The more they sling mud, the more it shows they're afraid. They know they've lost their grip." Her words struck something steady in me. She was right. Every rumor was not proof of weakness, but of their fear that the lifeline had ended. If I were truly irrelevant, they would not fight so hard to discredit me. Still, the tension weighed heavy. At the hardware store, Henry, an old neighbor, greeted me with an awkward half-smile and said he had heard there was trouble in my family. His tone carried curiosity more than concern, as if he expected me to deliver a juicy detail. I looked him straight in the eye and said only that families have storms, and that some storms clear the air. Then I paid for my light bulbs and walked out with my head high. At night, I lay awake sometimes hearing the echoes of Stephanie's voice on my porch, her threats disguised as warnings. I thought of Patricia weaving her story at some dinner table, making herself sound knowledgeable with her law clerk badge while poisoning my name. I thought of Michael silent now, letting others do the talking. The anger would rise in waves, but underneath it, a harder truth took root. Their campaign was proof that I had shaken the ground beneath them. One afternoon, I worked in the garden clipping the last of the roses when Mrs. Lee walked by with her dog. She hesitated, then stopped. "Margaret," she said gently, "people are saying things. I don't believe it, but I thought you should know." I nodded, thanked her, and patted the dog's head. I told her that truth does not need to shout, and that seemed to ease her. She smiled faintly before walking on. That evening, Janice came over again, this time without pie, but with a spark in her eye. She sat at my table and said, "They are desperate. Do you see it? The more noise they make, the clearer it is they know you have taken away what they counted on." I looked at her, the weight in my chest easing. She was right again. Every whisper, every suspicious glance was not evidence against me, but against them. They were the ones scrambling, spinning stories, preparing battles that had not even begun. Janice reached across the table and took my hand. "Margaret, you have nothing to prove. The people who matter know who you are. Let the rest talk." I gripped her hand back, feeling the warmth of her certainty steadying me. For years, I had been the one others leaned on. Now, it was enough to let a friend remind me that strength sometimes lies in silence and not needing to defend what is already true. The clock ticked softly, the house calm around us. Outside, the streetlights flickered on one by one. I breathed in deeply, and for the first time since the whispers began, I felt the balance shift back inside me. The louder they tried to discredit me, the more obvious it became that I had broken free of their hold. 2 evenings later, the phone rang just as the sun slipped below the trees. The house was quiet, and for a moment I considered letting it ring, but the screen showed Emily's name. I answered and heard only the sound of her breathing, uneven and quick. "Grandma, can I come over, please?" Within 20 minutes, she stood on my porch, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her eyes red from crying. I ushered her inside and set a glass of water in front of her. She gripped it with both hands but did not drink. "They're making me choose," she whispered. I sat across from her, waiting. "Mom says if I defend you, then I am betraying them. Dad says family loyalty means standing with him. They argue about it in front of me, and I feel like a rope they are pulling from both ends." Her shoulders shook and the words tumbled out. "At dinner last night, Mom said I was acting brainwashed by you. This morning, Dad said I had to remember who pays for my car insurance. They want me to say that you're wrong, that you're unstable, that you've been manipulated." The tears spilled faster now, and she buried her face in her hands. I reached across the table and stroked her arm, my heart breaking for the pressure she carried. "Emily, listen to me. You don't have to pick sides. You only have to live with your conscience. That is the only voice that matters." She lifted her head, eyes shining. "But what if they cut me off? What if they don't trust me anymore?" "Then they reveal who they are," I said gently. "Real love does not demand betrayal of someone else." She sniffled and tried to steady her breath. "I don't want to hurt them, but I can't lie about you. I see how they treat you. I see how you've always been there for us." I squeezed her hand. "Truth does not vanish because people refuse to look at it. You owe them honesty, not obedience." For a long moment we sat in silence, the kitchen clock marking the seconds. Then she pushed her chair back suddenly and came around the table, collapsing into my arms. Her sobs were muffled against my shoulder. "Grandma, I will never turn my back on you. Never." I held her close, my own eyes wet. I had expected resistance, anger, maybe even coldness after all the poison that had been poured into her ear. But here she was, trembling and strong at the same time, choosing her own ground. When she finally pulled back, she wiped her face with her sleeve. "I don't know what happens next, but I needed you to know that." I cupped her cheek. "Whatever happens, we face it together." She nodded, then tried to laugh through the tears. "Mom says I am too much like you. Maybe she's right." I smiled, though the ache in my chest remained. If being like me means refusing to bow to cruelty, then it is no insult. She stayed a while longer, curled on the couch under the Afghan while I made her tea. She told me about her classes, about her friend Sarah, who offered to lend her notes when she missed a lecture because of the fights at home. She spoke with relief, like a dam had cracked, and finally let the water run. When it grew late, I drove her back myself. We did not speak of what waited for her inside that house. As I pulled up to the curb, she squeezed my hand one more time. "Remember, Grandma, you're not alone." I watched her walk to the door, her shoulders straighter than when she arrived. The porch light flicked on the door opened and shadows moved inside. I waited until she was safely in before I drove away, the night air, cool through the open window. Back at my house, the silence welcomed me. I stood in the doorway, remembering her words, the way her arms had clung around me with all the force of loyalty that no gossip could sever. The storm outside was growing, but at the heart of it, I had something stronger than money or reputation. I had the truth of a granddaughter's love, and that truth could not be shaken. When the invitation came, it was worded as a request, but the tone was unmistakable. Michael asked me to come to their house on a Saturday afternoon, saying the family needed to talk things through. I knew it was not a request, but a summons, a stage set for confrontation. Still, I agreed. I had spent too many years hiding from their demands. This time, I would meet them head on. The living room was crowded when I arrived. Michael stood near the fireplace, arms crossed, his jaw set. Stephanie perched on the arm of a chair, eyes sharp as glass. Patricia, her cousin, was there too, notebook in hand. Her expression smooth and professional, though she was barely out of law school. A few other relatives had been invited, cousins I had not seen in years, sitting stiffly on the couch as if they had been told to act as witnesses. Emily was there too, seated on the far end of the sofa, her shoulders tense, but her eyes finding mine the moment I walked in. That was enough to steady me. Michael cleared his throat. "Mom, thank you for coming. We need to clear the air." Stephanie cut in before he could go on. "Let's not waste time. We all know what this is about. You have cut us off financially and rewritten your will. This is tearing the family apart." I set my purse down on the table and sat in the empty chair, my back straight. I have made my decisions. Patricia leaned forward, her voice calm, but carrying the cadence of rehearsed authority. "Margaret, decisions like these can have lasting consequences. It is important to make sure they are not rash. People might even think you were pressured." I met her eyes. I was not pressured. I was prepared. My doctor has certified my clarity, and my lawyer has ensured the documents are binding. Michael's voice rose. "So that's it. After everything, after all I have done, you cut me out entirely. After all I have done, I corrected." I reminded him of the years of payments, the mortgage, the tuition, the spa, the endless bills. I told him the total. His face tightened, his eyes flickering toward the floor. Stephanie snapped. "That was family duty. Parents help their children. Parents help their children to become independent, I said, not to remain dependents forever. The room went tense, eyes darting between us. Patricia cleared her throat again. Surely there is room for compromise, perhaps reinstating some support while revisiting the will at a later date. I shook my head. There will be no compromise. Michael's voice cracked with frustration. You can't just walk away. I kept my tone steady. I can and I have. The money is cut off. The will is changed. You should not expect another dollar. The silence that followed was thick, almost physical. No one seemed to know where to look. Even Stephanie, so quick with sharp words, faltered for a moment. Emily's eyes never left mine. She sat straighter, her lips pressed, but her gaze warm, filled with something that looked like pride. Finally, one of the cousins murmured that perhaps this was a private matter, but Stephanie shot them a look that silenced them. Michael tried again, softer this time. Mom, you're destroying this family. I answered just as softly. This family was already crumbling. I am only refusing to hold up the walls alone. Stephanie's hand tightened on the arm of the chair. You're choosing her over us, she said, gesturing toward Emily. I looked at my granddaughter and felt strength surge through me. I am choosing honesty over entitlement. Emily's eyes glistened, but she held my gaze. The room grew so quiet I could hear the faint tick of the clock in the hallway. No one spoke. The silence was its own verdict. At last, I stood, picked up my purse, and walked toward the door. My steps were steady, though I could feel the weight of every eye on me. I paused only once, glancing back at Emily. She gave me the smallest nod, her chin lifted, her face radiant with loyalty. I opened the door and stepped into the cool evening air. Behind me, the house remained silent, but I carried with me the only sound that mattered, the quiet strength of a granddaughter's unwavering support. The consequences arrived more quickly than even I expected. Within weeks, Michael and Stephanie's mortgage fell behind. Notices from the bank began to appear in their mailbox, the kind with bold letters and strict deadlines. I heard about it from Emily, who whispered over the phone that her parents fought late into the night, their voices loud enough to rattle the walls. She said Michael blamed Stephanie for overspending, while Stephanie blamed Michael for leaning on me for too long. The spa Stephanie had once boasted about was struggling. I drove past one afternoon and saw the parking lot nearly empty, a faded sign tilting in the wind. Later, I learned from a neighbor that the spa's bills had piled up, that vendors were demanding payment and clients were drifting away to newer businesses downtown. Then came the repossession notices. A neighbor mentioned that a tow truck had parked in front of their house, the driver examining the SUV that Stephanie was so proud of. The rumor spread quickly, and I could feel the shift in how people spoke about them. At the market one Saturday, I overheard two women at the checkout line. One said that Stephanie had been complaining at a luncheon, accusing me of abandoning the family. The other replied that maybe it was time Stephanie learned to live within her means. They noticed me behind them and flushed, but I only smiled politely and placed my bread on the conveyor. The change in the community was subtle at first, then louder. Friends who once flocked to Stephanie's parties stopped returning her calls. Women she had lunched with for years whispered behind her back. The word greedy was used more than once. One evening, I attended a church social where people gathered in the basement hall with casseroles and pies. I was speaking with Mrs. Lee when Stephanie stormed in, her cheeks, flushed, her eyes bright with anger. She spotted me across the room and marched straight over. "You did this," she hissed loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. You turned everyone against us. You left us to drown." The room grew still. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Conversations died mid-sentence. I kept my voice calm. "Stephanie, your situation is the result of your own choices." Her voice rose higher. "No, it is your selfishness. You had the money. You could have helped." Murmurs rippled around us. A man at one of the tables shook his head. A woman near the punch bowl muttered something about responsibility. Finally, Mrs. Lee spoke, her voice firm. "Stephanie, enough. We have all seen how much Margaret gave over the years. No one can blame her for setting boundaries." Others nodded their agreement clear. The words seemed to strike Stephanie harder than anything I could have said. She stood, frozen eyes darting around the room as if looking for an ally, but none came. She stammered, then tried again. "She owes us." But another voice, this time from Mr. Brown, cut through. "No, she does not. You and Michael need to stand on your own feet." The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. Stephanie's face flushed crimson, her hands clenched at her sides. Then, without another word, she spun on her heel and left the hall, the door slamming behind her. I stood still, my heart thudding in my chest. I had not wanted a public scene, but it had come all the same. Yet the reaction was not condemnation of me. It was condemnation of her. Mrs. Lee patted my arm. "Don't let her words touch you. People see the truth now." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. For years I had carried the weight of their demands in silence. Now the truth was speaking for itself, carried not by me, but by the voices of the community. That night, as I sat in my quiet living room, I thought about what had unfolded. Karma had taken its time, but it had arrived. Financial strain, social isolation, the unraveling of the image Stephanie had polished so carefully. They were consequences I had not engineered, but simply allowed to take their natural course once I stepped away. The clock ticked steadily in the hall. I breathed deeply, feeling a calm I had not known in years. The storm they had created was finally theirs to weather, and I no longer stood in its path. A week later, an envelope arrived in my mailbox, the handwriting on the front unmistakable. Michael had written my name in large, uneven letters, as if his hand had trembled while he addressed it. I carried it inside and sat at the kitchen table staring at it for a long while before sliding a knife under the flap. Inside was a letter, several pages folded neatly, the ink smudged in places. His words were not the voice of the angry son who had shouted in the living room weeks earlier. They were the words of a man stripped down by consequences. He wrote that he knew I had changed the will, that he understood now why I had done it. He admitted that he and Stephanie had leaned too hard on me, that he had confused my love with obligation. He said he was sorry, and more than once he wrote that word as if repetition could erase the past. Near the end, his words grew softer. He asked if there was still room for him in my life, even if there was no longer room for him in my accounts. I folded the letter carefully and sat with it in my lap. My heart ached not with the old burden of guilt, but with the sharper sting of truth. He was my son, and though he had wounded me deeply, some part of me would always want him near. The following Sunday, he came to see me. He stood on my porch without Stephanie. His shoulders slumped, his eyes tired. I let him in, and for a long moment neither of us spoke. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Mom, I know what I lost. I know what I broke. I cannot change the past, but I want to try to change now." I studied his face, searching for the boy I once raised. I spoke slowly, choosing each word. "I am willing to have a relationship with you, Michael, but it will only happen if you respect my boundaries. I will not be your bank. I will not be the person you turn to when the bills come due. I will be your mother, not your lifeline." His eyes filled and he nodded. "I can accept that." For the first time in many months, I felt the smallest seed of peace between us. Later that week, Emily came by carrying a bakery box tied with string. She set it on the table with a grin. "I thought you could use something sweet." Inside were lemon bars dusted with powdered sugar. We sat together, plates in front of us, the afternoon light slanting across the kitchen. She talked about school, about the book she was reading, about her hopes for college. I listened, savoring both the dessert and the sound of her voice. At one point, she reached across the table and took my hand. "Grandma, you are stronger than anyone I know." I squeezed her hand and smiled. Maybe I am only strong because I waited so long to say no. We laughed, and the sound filled the house in a way I had not heard for years. When evening came and Emily left, I lingered at the table alone. The folder with the bank papers and the trust lay nearby, but I no longer felt the need to touch it for reassurance. The strength was not in the papers anymore. It was in me. As I washed the last dish and turned out the lights, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. For years, I had been defined by sacrifice, by silence, by the endless giving of myself. Now, I was defined by something else: boundaries, respect, self-worth. I had taken back my life not in a grand gesture, but in steady choices, one signature, one conversation, one closed door at a time. And if you are listening now, I want you to hear this. Do not wait for permission to live your own life. Do not stay small because others expect you to serve their needs. Step out of the shadow of their demands. Set your boundaries. Claim your worth. Your life is yours, and only you have the right to decide how it will be lived.